The wind hit Medicine Bow Valley like a freight train on January 14th, 1874. And by the time Thomas Garrett realized his cabin's chimney was collapsing under 18 inches of ice, Margaret Brennan's stone shelter was the only structure within 12 miles still standing. The temperature had dropped to 43 degrees below zero in less than 2 hours. 7 families were about to learn whether a 38-year-old Irish widow knew more about Wyoming winters than men who'd survived the Bozeman Trail. But 6 months earlier, those same men had laughed themselves sick watching her haul limestone. Margaret had arrived in Medicine Bow Valley in March of 1873 with nothing but $212, a wagon full of tools that had belonged to her late husband, and a land claim for 160 acres that the previous owner had abandoned after a single winter. The claim sat at the base of Elk Mountain, where the wind funneled through a natural gap and temperatures could swing 40 degrees in an afternoon. Jakob of Kessler, who'd homesteaded the adjacent property for 6 years, had told her straight that she was building in the worst spot in the valley. That ground freezes 4 feet down, he'd said, pulling on his beard. You can't dig a proper foundation until May, and by then you'll have lost your planting season. She'd thanked him for his concern and started quarrying stone in April, when the ground was still half frozen and most folks were repairing winter damage. The thing was, Margaret had grown up in County Clare, where her grandfather had built stone cottages that stood for 200 years through Atlantic gales that made Wyoming wind look friendly. She'd watched him work since she could walk, learning how stone held heat, how thickness mattered more than height, and how a properly built structure could turn the worst weather into an advantage. Her husband had homesteaded in eastern Kansas before dying of typhoid in '72, and she'd sold that flat prairie claim the moment the ground thawed. She wanted elevation stone and a place where the old techniques would actually save lives, instead of just making them slightly more comfortable. The skeptics lined up like crows on a fence line. Thomas Garrett had come west after 15 years as an Army engineer, and he'd seen enough of what he called immigrant foolishness to fill a manual. He'd built a solid timber cabin using regulation Army specifications with double walls and a pitched roof designed to shed snow. When Margaret showed him her plans for 3-foot thick stone walls and a nearly flat roof covered in sod, he'd actually laughed. Mrs. Brennan stone's fine for a root cellar, but it's dead weight for a dwelling. That roof will cave in come the first real snow, and you can't heat stone proper without burning through half a cord a day. He wasn't trying to be cruel. He genuinely built by the book, and the book said timber framed with proper ventilation. Samuel Chen, who'd come to Wyoming after the railroad work dried up and had spent 3 years proving up his own claim, had different concerns. Stone stays cold, he told her in his careful English, mixing Chinese building wisdom with what he'd learned on the frontier. My family builds with earth and wood because they breathe. Stone traps moisture grows. Mold makes you sick by February. He'd offered to help her build a proper dugout with a timber front wall instead, something that would actually work with the land instead of fighting it. Even Catherine Lindstrom, a Swedish woman who'd survived 4 Wyoming winters and whose sod house was considered the model for the valley, thought Margaret was making dangerous mistakes. Saw on wood frame is one thing, Catherine had said, watching Margaret mark out foundation lines. But that much stone, how are you going to get it up? How are you going to mortar it before frost? She gestured at the pile of limestone chunks Margaret had already hauled from an outcrop 2 miles south, You'll spend all summer building and have no crops, no provisions, and come November, you'll be begging to winter with someone else. Margaret had smiled that quiet smile that made the skeptics more nervous than if she'd argued. My grandfather always said the house feeds the family, she'd replied. Build it wrong, and you'll freeze, or starve, no matter how much you plant. What none of them understood yet was that Margaret wasn't guessing. She'd spent the previous winter in a boarding house in Laram, reading every meteorological record she could find and talking to railroad workers about what they'd seen. Wyoming didn't just get cold. It got suddenly cold with temperature drops that could kill cattle in open fields and freeze water barrels solid in under an hour. The wind was relentless, coming down off Elk Mountain at speeds that could tear shingles off and collapse poorly braced walls. And the snow didn't fall gentle like it did in Ireland or even Kansas. It came horizontal, building up in drifts that could bury a cabin's first story and create weight loads that normal roofs couldn't handle. She needed thermal mass. She needed a structure that could absorb a blizzard's punishment and turn all that cold into an advantage. And she needed to start building before anyone could talk her into a conventional solution that would get her killed. By mid-May, she'd quarried enough limestone to start the foundation. The stone, in this part of Wyoming, was a gift from God. Sedimentary layers that split clean with wedges and had been sitting in dry conditions long enough to be stable. Each block weighed between 40 and 90 pounds, sized to what she could lift and position herself, though Jacob's teenage sons had helped with some of the monsters that topped 120 pounds. She dug the foundation trench 42 inches deep, going down past the frost line Jacob had warned her about, and she'd filled it with the largest stones, setting them in a lime mortar she'd mixed from local deposits. The foundation alone had taken 6 weeks. Thomas Garrett had stopped by in early June, watched her work for 20 minutes, and shaken his head. You're still doing this, Mrs. Brennan. You haven't even got walls up, and it's almost planting season. This is exactly what I'm talking about. Old country methods that don't scale to frontier conditions. But here's what Thomas hadn't noticed. Margaret's foundation was 16 inches in thick and extended 8 inches above grade all the way around. It wasn't just support. It was the beginning of a thermal battery that would store summer heat and winter cold in ways that timber never could. She'd left no gaps, used no wood, and created a base that would distribute the weight of those 3 FFT walls across bearing points every 14 inches. The limestone itself was dense enough to stop wind infiltration completely, while being porous enough to manage moisture. And the lime mortar she'd mixed was a traditional Roman formula, 3 parts sand to 1 part lime, that would actually get stronger with age. If you're watching this and wondering how traditional building techniques survived for centuries, while modern shortcuts keep failing, you're starting to understand why this channel exists. Hit that subscribe button because we're documenting the knowledge that kept people alive before we had central heating and building codes. And these stories matter more now than most folks realize. The walls went up through June and July, rising 4 inches per day on average. Margaret worked alone most days, though Catherine brought food sometimes and stayed to help lift stone. The technique was simple but precise. Large stones on the outside and inside faces, rubble and mortar fill in the middle, each course carefully leveled and allowed to cure for a day before the next layer. By August, the walls stood 7 feet tall and were 36 inches thick at the base, tapering to 30 inches at the top. The structure was only 18 feet by 24 feet. Interior, smaller than the Army manual cabins, but those walls represented a thermal mass equivalent to about 14 cords of wood and heat storage capacity. Samuel had stopped by in early August, bringing his son to see what he called the stone fortress. He'd walked the perimeter examining the mortar joints and running calculations in his head. "This is solid work," he'd admitted, surprise clear in his voice. "But Mrs. Brennan, you still haven't answered the heating question. Stone this thick takes forever to warm up. You'll burn through your wood supply by Christmas just trying to take the chill off." Margaret had been expecting this. She'd built the fireplace into the north wall, making it massive, 6 feet wide, 4 feet deep, with a stone bench on each side and a chimney that used waste heat to warm stones before venting outside. But the real innovation was what she'd done with the floor. Instead of laying it at grade like a normal cabin, she dug down another 22 inches and created a crawl space that connected to the fireplace's ash pit through a series of stone channels. Warm air from the fire would heat the floor stones from below, while the walls absorbed and radiated heat for hours after the fire died. She'd also built in ventilation channels through the thick walls, narrow passages that could be opened or closed with stone plugs, allowing her to control airflow without losing heat. "The stone doesn't just store heat," she'd explained to Samuel. "It evens it out. I fire this hard for 4 hours, and it'll stay warm for 16. Plus, all this mass means the temperature inside changes slow. Real slow. When it's 20 below outside, it might be 55 in here without any fire at all, just from yesterday's heat, still radiating." Samuel had nodded slowly. His own people had built with thermal mass for thousands of years. He understood the principle, even if he'd never seen it applied quite this way. But the roof he'd pressed. "You're still planning that flat design," she was. And this is where things got interesting, because Margaret had seen something during her winter in Laram that most settlers never noticed. The snow didn't just fall down. It got redistributed by wind piling up on Lydas and scouring off windward slopes. A peaked roof would create drifts on one side and might shed snow onto the doorway. But a slightly pitched roof, she designed hers with just a 4-inch drop from north to south over 18 feet, would let the wind skim across the top while the snow compacted into a layer of insulation. Combined with the sod she planned to lay over wooden planks, she'd have a roof with an R value that no amount of shingles could match. The roof went on in September. She'd used local cottonwood for the beams, cutting them herself and dragging them in with her 2 mules. Each beam spanned the 24-foot width and was seated in the stone walls with 8 inches of bearing surface. Over the beams went planks, then a layer of birch bark for waterproofing, then 12 inches of sod cut from her own property in 2-foot squares. The whole assembly weighed approximately 4,000 pounds, but distributed across 12 beams seated in 3-foot thick stone walls. The load was absolutely manageable. Thomas Garrett's army cabin roof weighed maybe 800 pounds by comparison, but it was also trying to shed snow rather than use it. By October 1st, the shelter was complete, and Margaret moved in with her few possessions. She'd spent exactly $173 on lime tools she didn't already have, and the cottonwood beams. Everything else? The stone, the sand, the sod, the labor had come from her own land and hands. She'd worked roughly 12 hours a day for 168 days, which meant the structure represented about 2,000 hours of skilled labor. A hired crew would have cost $500 minimum if you could even find men willing to build something this unconventional. The neighbors watched and waited. Catherine had brought over a loaf of bread and some preserves on moving day, and she'd stood in the center of the single room, looking up at that massive, flat roof with undisguised worry. "Margaret, I hope you're right about this," she'd said quietly. "I truly do, but that roof scares me. We get 3-foot snows up here." "I know," Margaret had replied. "I'm counting on it." November brought cold, but nothing exceptional. Temperatures ranged from 15 to 35 degrees, and Margaret kept small fires going just to test her heating theory. She'd been exactly right about the thermal mass effect. 4 hours of fire in the morning kept the interior at 58 to 62 degrees until she built another fire at night. The thick walls meant the temperature changed so slowly that she barely noticed the outdoor swings. When it dropped to 10 degrees overnight, the interior only drifted down to 53 by morning. The stone was doing exactly what she designed it to do, absorbing heat during the warm parts of the day and radiating it back during cold snaps. Thomas Garrett had stopped by in late November, ostensibly to check on her welfare. He'd stepped inside, felt the warmth, and examined the fireplace setup with grudging interest. "I'll admit it's warmer than I expected," he'd said. "But you're burning, what, half a cord every 2 weeks? That's still a lot of wood." "Quarter cord," Margaret had corrected. "And I'm heating about 432 cubic feet to comfort levels. Your cabin's heating maybe 700 cubic feet, and you're going through a cord every 10 days. She'd said it matter-of-factly, not gloating. The numbers spoke for themselves. He'd frowned, doing the math in his head. The efficiency difference was real. Stone stored heat so effectively that she could fire intensely for short periods instead of maintaining a constant burn. Less wood meant less hauling, less chopping, less time spent on fuel instead of other survival tasks. Still doesn't solve the roof problem, he'd muttered. But his skepticism had shifted from certain disaster to reluctant waiting. December came quiet, then increasingly hostile. The temperature dropped to 0 on December 8th, stayed there for 4 days, then crashed to 17 below on the 12th. Margaret's interior temperature drifted down to 48 degrees during the coldest night. But a single 4-hour fire the next morning brought it back to 62, and the walls held that warmth through another bitter night. She was using less than a cord per month, while staying consistently more comfortable than anyone else in the valley. The stone had won the heating argument, but the real test was still coming, and nobody knew it yet. Weather in Wyoming territory followed patterns that meteorologists in Cheyenne were just beginning to document. Cold air from Canada would build up behind mountain ranges, sometimes for weeks, creating pressure differentials that could release with devastating speed. When that happened, temperatures didn't just drop, they collapsed. And when the cold air hit moisture coming up from the south, you got blizzards that could bury entire settlements and kill anyone caught outside. The sign started on January 12th. The temperature rose to 38 degrees by afternoon, warm enough that Jacob's wife hung laundry outside. The wind shifted to the southeast, bringing air that smelled like moisture despite the winter season. And the clouds built up on Elk Mountain's north face, with that peculiar yellow-gray color that old-timers recognized as serious trouble. Samuel Chen recognized it too. He'd seen mountain weather in California during his railroad days, and he knew that warm before a storm meant cold during it. He rode to Margaret's place just before sunset and found her reinforcing the sod on her roof, adding extra chunks in a diagonal pattern. "Storm coming," he'd said simply. I know she'd replied, not stopping her work. "Big one. You should stay with Catherine or come to our place. That roof. We'll be fine." She looked at him directly. "Samuel, I built this for exactly what's coming, but tell Jacob and Thomas to get their stock inside if they can, and anyone with a weak roof should know it's going to be bad. He'd written off to spread warnings, still unconvinced, but unwilling to argue with a woman who'd proven more right than wrong about her stone fortress. By midnight, the temperature had dropped to 12 degrees. By 4 a.m., on January 14th, it hit zero. And by 6 a.m., when the sun should have been rising, the temperature was 21 below and falling fast. The blizzard hit Medicine Bow Valley at 7:14 in the morning, with wind speeds that would later be estimated at 70 miles per hour. Snow didn't fall. It flew horizontally, building drifts on the lee side of structures at roughly 6 inches per hour. Thomas Garrett's cabin, built to Army specifications, with its peaked roof and double timber walls, started taking damage within the first 2 hours. The wind pressure on the windward side caused the chinking to fail, and snow began infiltrating through gaps in the wall assembly. His chimney, built of riverstone and mud mortar, developed cracks as the extreme temperature shift caused uneven contraction. By 10 a.m., his wife Emma was stuffing rags into gaps, while Thomas tried to keep the fire going, despite wind-sucking air through the failing chinking. Their interior temperature had dropped to 38 degrees and was still falling. The peaked roof was shedding snow beautifully, exactly as designed, but the wind pressure was causing the timber frame to flex, and each flex widened the gaps in the walls. At Jacob Kessler's place, the problem was different. His cabin sat in a slight depression that offered some wind protection, but the snow was accumulating against his north wall at a terrifying rate. By noon, the drift was 4 feet high and pressing against his door with enough force that he couldn't open it. His family of 5 was trapped inside, with temperatures dropping and their wood supply running lower than he'd planned for this early in winter. Catherine Lindstrom's sod house, the model everyone pointed to, was handling the wind better than timber, but facing its own crisis. The snow had found a weak point, where the sod roof met the timber front wall, and water from melting snow at the roofline was freezing as it dripped, creating an ice dam that was forcing moisture back into the sod. By early afternoon, sections of her ceiling were dripping, and she was catching water in every pot she owned while trying to keep her children warm and dry. Samuel Chen's family was in the best shape among the conventional structures. His combination of earthing and tight construction was handling the wind well, but even he was burning through wood faster than sustainable. The extreme cold was simply overwhelming normal heating strategies. And then there was Margaret. Inside her stone shelter, the blizzard sounded like distant thunder. The wind pressure was hitting those 3-foot walls with tremendous force, but stone, under compression, is essentially indestructible. The snow was piling onto her nearly flat roof, exactly as she'd planned, building up in a uniform layer that got thicker by the hour. By noon, there was roughly 28 inches of snow on that roof, representing a weight load of approximately 7,000 additional pounds on top of the 4,000-pound roof structure itself. 11,000 pounds total, supported by 12 cottonwood beams, seated in stone walls, built to handle far more. The interior temperature at noon was 61 degrees. She'd built one fire at 6 a.m. before the storm hit, and the stone was still radiating that heat 7 hours later. The walls, already at thermal equilibrium from months of conditioning, were now benefiting from an insulating blanket of snow on the roof. The R value of her total roof assembly, planks bark sod, plus 2 feet of fresh snow, was somewhere north of 45, better than any modern insulated attic. Heat loss through the roof had essentially stopped. But more importantly, all that mass meant stability. While the temperature outside swung from 21 below to 37 below, to back up to 18 below As the storm evolved, Margaret's interior temperature varied by less than 3 degrees over 12 hours. The stone absorbed changes so slowly that the chaos outside barely registered inside. At 2 p.m., with the storm entering its worst phase and the temperature hitting 43 below zero, Margaret heard something over the wind. It sounded like shouting. She pulled on her heaviest coat, wrapped a scarf around her face, and opened her door, which opened outwards, specifically, so snow couldn't trap her, to find Samuel Chen and Thomas Garrett struggling through waist-deep drifts toward her shelter. Thomas's face was covered in ice from frozen breath, and Samuel was limping from a twisted ankle. Thomas shouted over the wind, "My chimney collapsed. Emma and the children are freezing." They stumbled inside, and Margaret slammed the door shut behind them. The two men stood there gasping and shaking, and then slowly realized what they were feeling. It was warm, not survival level warm. Genuinely comfortable warm. The fire had died to coals 3 hours ago, yet the temperature was still above 60 degrees. Thomas stared at the massive stone walls, at the flat ceiling, showing no signs of stress, at the fireplace that had used maybe a tenth of the wood his setup would have required. "How?" he asked simply. "Physics," Margaret replied, already pulling out blankets and stoking the coals back to flames. How many people need shelter? By nightfall, Margaret's 18 by 24-foot stone shelter housed 17 people. Thomas's family of 4, Jacob's family of 5, who managed to dig out their door and make the half-mile trek through the storm. Catherine and her 3 children with water damage, making her sod house uninhabitable. Samuel's wife and son, giving him space to recover from his ankle injury. And Margaret herself hosting everyone with a calm efficiency that came from knowing exactly what her structure could handle. She fired the massive fireplace hard for 6 hours, using about 1/8 of a cord to heat the space to 68 degrees. The 17 people added body heat, roughly 600 BTUs per hour per person, which the stone absorbed and redistributed. She opened the ventilation channel she'd built into the walls, allowing moisture from breathing and wet clothes to escape, while the thermal mass maintained stable temperature. The floor heated from below through those stone channels stayed warm enough that children could sit on it comfortably. Outside, the storm raged through the night. The temperature bottomed out at 46 below zero at 3 a.m. Wind speeds stayed above 50 miles per hour until dawn. The snow accumulation hit 37 inches in the valley, with drifts topping 9 feet in places. It was the worst blizzard medicine Bow Valley had seen in recorded history, and it would later be documented as one of the defining weather events of the decade in Wyoming territory. Inside the stone shelter, 17 people survived in relative comfort. Margaret kept the fire going through the night, but at levels far below what would have been needed in any other structure. The stone walls radiated stored heat so effectively that the interior temperature never dropped below 63 degrees. Children slept. Adults took turns staying awake, but mostly out of caution, rather than necessity. The structure that had been laughed at 6 months earlier was now the only thing standing between two families and freezing to death. By dawn, on January 15th, the storm had passed. The sun came up on a landscape transformed into white desolation, with drifts so high that several cabins were buried to their roof lines. Thomas Garrett's cabin had survived, but sustained serious damage. The chimney destroyed multiple wall sections, compromised by wind infiltration, and enough ice buildup inside to make it uninhabitable until proper repairs could be completed. Jacob's cabin was intact, but required extensive digging out and had burned through his wood supply to dangerous levels. Catherine's sod house would need complete roof replacement once the thaw came, and Margaret's stone shelter sat exactly as it had been built, with 3 feet of snow compacted on the roof, adding insulation and structural weight that made the whole assembly even more stable. The walls showed no cracks, no frost damage, no compromise whatsoever. The interior had stayed warm and dry throughout conditions that had pushed every other structure to failure or beyond. The family stayed 2 more days while people dug out and made temporary repairs. Margaret fed them from her root cellar, which had remained at a steady 38 degrees throughout the storm. Thanks to the same thermal mass principles, she shared what she had without comment or judgment. These were her neighbors, and they'd needed help. That's how it worked on the frontier. But on the 3rd day, when Jacob and his sons had cleared paths, and Thomas had jury-rigged a temporary chimney, the families prepared to return home. Jacob pulled Margaret aside, his weathered face serious. "Mrs. Brennan, I owe you an apology. I thought you were building a tomb. Turned out you built the only safe place in the valley." Thomas Garrett was less comfortable with admitting error, but he managed it. "I was wrong about the stone," he said stiffly, "and the roof and the heating. I built by the manual, and the manual nearly got my family killed." He paused, then added, with surprising humility, "Would you be willing to show me how you did the foundation I need to rebuild my chimney, and I'd like to do it right this time." Samuel Chen simply bowed to her, a gesture of respect that acknowledged both her skill and her generosity. Catherine hugged her and whispered, "Thank you for saving us, and thank you for being right when everyone else was wrong." Word of the storm and Margaret's shelter spread through the territory with the speed of summer wildfire. By spring, 3 families in Medicine Bow Valley had started their own stone structures using variations of her techniques. Thomas Garrett rebuilt his entire cabin using limestone. He quarried himself with 3-foot walls and a modified flat roof design. Jacob added stone to his existing cabin, creating a hybrid structure that combined his woodworking skills with Margaret's thermal mass principles. Even the territorial surveyor from Laram came out to document the shelter, measuring the walls, examining the roof structure, and taking notes on the heating system. Margaret helped them all, sharing her knowledge freely because that's what survival required. You didn't hoard techniques that could save lives. You taught them, improved them, and made sure the next generation built better than the last. The historical record shows that Medicine Bow Valley lost no settlers to the blizzard of January 1874. Unusual for a storm of that magnitude. The credit belongs to one woman who understood that traditional knowledge wasn't backward. It was tested over centuries and adapted to local conditions by people whose lives depended on getting it right. The limestone she quarried still exists in Wyoming. The same sedimentary deposits that made her shelter possible. The principle she used, thermal mass controlled ventilation snow as insulation, show up in modern, sustainable building designs, though often presented as innovations rather than rediscoveries. If you've stayed with this story, you understand why preserving this knowledge matters. These weren't just interesting people doing interesting things. They were solving fundamental survival problems with solutions that still work today. Subscribe to help keep these techniques documented and available. Because the wisdom of Margaret Brennan and thousands like her deserves better than being forgotten in favor of methods that fail when we need them most. Margaret Brennan lived in that stone shelter until her death in 1891 at age 55. She never married again, proved up her 160 acres, and raised enough cattle and crops to make a modest living. Her shelter required virtually no maintenance. Stone doesn't rot, and good masonry only gets stronger with age. When she died, she left the property to Catherine Lindstrom's oldest daughter, who lived in the same structure until 1923. The shelter itself stood until 1947, when it was finally dismantled by a great-grandson who wanted to build a modern ranch house. Photographs from the demolition show mortar joints still solid after 73 years, wall stones in perfect condition, and the beam pockets in the walls showing no signs of rot or damage. The cottonwood beams protected from weather by the stone and saw roof were still structurally sound. Several of those beams were saved and later donated to a Wyoming historical society, where they remain as physical proof of what one woman built, with knowledge, stone, and absolute conviction. Modern engineers have analyzed Margaret's design using contemporary structural modeling software. The numbers confirm what frontier settlers learned through experience. Her wall thickness was actually overbuilt for the loads she faced, meaning she could have gone thinner and saved labor. But that overbuilding is why the structure survived 3/4 of a century with zero maintenance. Her heating system, based on radiant mass and controlled airflow, achieved thermal efficiency comparable to modern passive solar designs. The roof structure, with its snow load capacity and insulation values, exceeded modern building codes for extreme climate zones. But the real legacy isn't in the numbers. It's in the principle that Margaret demonstrated. Traditional techniques developed in one environment could be thoughtfully adapted to another if you understood the underlying physics. Irish stone cottages weren't directly transferable to Wyoming, but the knowledge of how stone behaves, how it stores heat, manages moisture, and provides mass, absolutely was. She took that knowledge, studied the local conditions, and created something that worked better than anything imported from Eastern building manuals or military specifications. The skeptics who laughed at her limestone hauling came away from that blizzard with a different understanding. It wasn't that they were stupid or she was magical. It's that frontier survival required willingness to question accepted methods and test alternatives when the stakes were life and death. Thomas Garrett's Army manual had worked fine in Virginia. It nearly killed his family in Wyoming. Margaret's grandfather's Irish techniques would have failed on the Kansas prairie. Modified for Wyoming conditions, they saved 17 lives. This is what traditional wisdom really means. Not blind adherence to old methods, but understanding principles deeply enough to adapt them intelligently. Margaret knew why stone worked. Not just that it worked, she understood thermal mass heat transfer, structural loading, and moisture management at a level that came from watching her grandfather and then thinking through how those same physics would play out in a completely different climate. The frontier demanded this kind of thinking from everyone who survived it. You couldn't just copy what your neighbor did. You had to understand what worked, why it worked, and how to make it work for your specific situation. The settlers who thrived were the ones who combined respect for traditional knowledge with willingness to test and verify. The ones who failed were usually the ones who either rejected all tradition as primitive or accepted all tradition as sacred. Both extremes got you killed. Margaret Brennan represents something important that we've mostly lost. The idea that ordinary people could be genuine experts in survival technology. She wasn't an engineer with formal training. She was a widow who'd paid attention, learned from her grandfather, studied her environment, and applied knowledge carefully. The stone shelter wasn't luck or inspiration. It was methodical application of understood principles to a specific problem. And when it worked, she didn't lord it over anyone. She shared the knowledge so others could build their own versions. That generosity of knowledge matters as much as the knowledge itself. Imagine if she'd kept her technique secret, charging people to build their structures or refusing to teach others. The valley's building stock would have stayed vulnerable, and the next blizzard would have killed people who could have been saved. Instead, within 5 years of the 1874 storm, Medicine Bow Valley had become known throughout Wyoming territory as a place where people built stone-built smart and survived winters that devastated settlements using conventional methods. The lesson extends beyond stone shelters. Every time we dismiss traditional techniques as backward or primitive, we risk losing solutions that could solve modern problems. Every time we assume newer is automatically better, we ignore centuries of empirical testing that sorted working methods from failures. And every time we fail to document and share knowledge that could save lives or reduce suffering, we repeat the mistakes of those who came before us. Margaret Brennan built one stone shelter in Wyoming in 1873, but the real construction was a proof of concept that changed how an entire valley approached survival. That's worth remembering, that's worth documenting, and that's worth carrying forward. If this story resonated with you, if you see the value in preserving knowledge that worked when everything else failed, hit that like button and leave a comment about traditional techniques that deserve more attention. These stories matter. These methods matter. And remembering that a 38-year-old Irish widow knew more about Wyoming survival than trained Army engineers matters too. Not because it makes her special, but because it proves that careful observation, traditional knowledge, and intelligent adaptation can solve problems that manuals and regulations miss. Margaret's shelter saved 17 lives on one January night, but the knowledge she demonstrated that stone could work in Wyoming, that thermal mass could solve extreme cold, that flat roofs could handle snow loads. That knowledge probably saved hundreds more over the following decades. As others learned from her success, that's the real legacy. Not what one person built, but what many people learned. And we're still learning from it today, whether we realize it or not.